Good evening. I would like to call this April 29th, 2024 School Board Work Session to order. The time is now 5:30. The school board would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that we reside on the traditional lands of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent and equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so that all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Ms. Richardson, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Burgess,
Here.
Mrs. Burnett,
Here.
Miss Maple is excused, and Mrs. Sanderson are excused. Mr. Dorn,
Here.
Miss Maradi,
Here.
Mrs. Hardy.
Here.
Thank you. Board has a quorum.
Thank you. At this time, I will turn it over to administration.
All right, thank you, President Hardy. I'll start out with some opening remarks on AR 9130. We'll start the conversation there. So some of my homework from last week was connecting with CDOR's office in terms of some of the questions we had and the possible additions to this AR, one of those being both a disqualification of potential members on committees prior to the seating of on committees, and once seated, the disqualification of members. And so in my conversations with Mr. Cedar,
Sorry, Jasmine. You're okay. We're just having some visual problems. Your audio is going, and we'll get the video.
perfect, that's probably better for the listening and watching public anyway. So it will be in 9130, the next one. So right after the so not changed yet on the draft, but his recommendation would be to stay away from any disqualifying language prior to seating individuals on committees. He said this could lead to viewpoint discrimination, which is problematic, but he would help us if we're interested in crafting standards for committees, and then if seated members are not like living up to those standards, then the committee chair could have discretion to remove the member at that point in time. He made a couple other comments on this AR because I had just sent him the entire thing. He did recommend, and he said other school districts are moving in this direction of not listing FEA, ESSA, and FPA in policy or AR due to the Janus decision, which basically says that members don't have to join unions, and it precludes individuals that are not in unions from getting to participate in things like committees. So wanted the board to be aware of that. His recommendation would be to list teacher, support staff, and principal if you're talking about FEA, ESSA, and FPA.
Can I ask a question on
Yep.
that? How would we handle, since those are appointed by their union representation, if we were to remove it and just go to like teacher?
Yeah, so I think we'd have to run a different application process than what we're currently running. So it'd be similar to community members, and that individual teachers would just submit their interest, and then if it's first come, first served, then that's the process that we would follow. Or if we had some other established process, then we would follow that.
One more question. Is the union's participation on these committees part of their contract, where we need to also go back and it seems like we're changing, or if we were to change a piece, what are the other pieces that would need to be changed to do that?
I would need to triple check, but it's my understanding that participation on board committees specifically, if this is what we're talking about, it wouldn't change that. But if we were changing it in other locations, I would need to check to make sure that it's not a part of the contract. So, there is a piece of the contract, and I always forget, it's either Ed Excellence or Teacher Advisory. One of those is specifically in FEA's contract. So like if that was matched up with policy, we wouldn't go outside of FEA. But if it was in general that we were looking for teachers to serve in some kind of capacity, we would say teachers rather than FEA.
Sorry, Mr. Doran.
Thank you, and for that research on it. So just exploring this a little bit. Our bargaining units represent all certified support staff, principals respectively, whether they're members or not. So I'm thinking practicalities, and since they also have a major voice within that, and I guess if we were to, so I'm kind of thinking through this with my question. We had some conversation about whether parents and at large could be an employee. Could we have that distinction that the bargaining units, or that it goes through the bargaining unit? And because I think we don't want to lose that voice if we have someone who really doesn't represent one of those bargaining units. That means a major stakeholder is not included. And we've indicated that that person could also apply as a parent or community at large. So I'm just trying to think this through. What does it do to us? And that's not necessarily just to administration, but I tossed it out to the board.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I just received this information this afternoon, so I think I'm still processing through it as well. I mean, part of me thinks it may potentially open up a larger group of folks that might be interested in participating, but I think on the flip side of that, it might also introduce complexities in finding people to serve on the committees. So I'm sure there's pros and cons to both approaches.
Ms. Marati.
Thanks, and I apologize, Mr. Doran, if I'm repeating you, but I believe, I'm looking at the AR that we currently have, and it might be in here too, but I'm looking it up on our policies online, and it doesn't say FEA, ESSA, FPA, but it does say that the presidents of those associations will appoint. But it does say on our webpage, like I just looked at one of our committee web pages, and it says like FEA rep, ESSA rep. So in policy, it seems like it's agreed with Mr. Sedor's recommendation, but in advertising, it's not. I appreciate his recommendation, and actually I support that right now. And I believe what we came to, and maybe Ms. Dillard has a better memory of it, when we met last time, the board was, was leaning towards a post-appointment standards that we could lean on, as opposed to pre-appointment that Sedor says is not probably a good way to go. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we knew where we landed, and we didn't have time to, draft new language. And so if that's the consensus of the board, I think that's a easy change. And then we could certainly bring language back in terms of the standards for, sitting on committees and what would qualify for committee chairs to disqualify a committee member.
Mr. Doran.
Okay. So looking at both things, points have come up. One is I still lean towards keeping the appointment by FEA, ESSA, and FPA. That they could consider anyone in those categories, but they would come through that. The last point that we're making, so one of the questions was on the pre-appointment soliciting applications. We've, by practice, done first come, first serve. Did you have a chance to weigh in with Mr. Sedor on what practices are in other committees at this point, or?
I didn't go that deep into it with him in terms of kind of the application procedures. He did note that our AR is much more comprehensive than any other school districts he's seen on board committees, so he was impressed with that. But we we didn't delve into, deciding on who sits on the specific committees, but could certainly follow up if the board wanted me to do so.
Okay, I know I am, follow-up with that is, I strongly endorse the practice that we've had of first come, first serve. I think the idea of, okay, once you're on some standards makes sense if, because we need people there at the table and talking or sharing. So I just want to put that out there, that I definitely like the practice that we have. And I think that we may still need to come back to AR, but we could move ahead with policies, come back with AR that may need to be rewritten in light of the policy that we adopt. So, and I would just say is we can check in terms of other districts and, through Mr. Cedar or through AASB.
Ms. Burnett?
Thank you, President Hardy. That's a whole lot. I don't know how I feel about that. I definitely think we should look at that further with CEDOR, the removal of FEA. That to me seems like a very sketchy territory to be diving into, trying to remove that kind of language from our committees. But that aside, I'm going back to the language with the disqualifications. You just said before committee seating, not after, or the whole thing?
So he advised us not to create any language prior to being seated on a committee, that could lead to viewpoint discrimination, but that after you've formed committees, somebody's sitting on a committee, that you'd have certain standards, and if somebody wasn't living up to those standards, then the chair could dismiss somebody at that point in time. And things like, serious disruptions, right? Not allowing meetings to go on, not showing up for meetings, those types of things, not just because they disagree with, some of the conversations that are happening at a committee level.
Okay, so follow up to that then. I would be in favor of removing the disqualification piece if we did come up with like a board norms or committee norm. I don't know how that would be phrased, but Aaron knows what I'm saying.
Ms. Marati?
Yeah, I think you're agreeing with what I said earlier. One thing we did talk about was language around, last meeting was language around parent versus parent guardian versus family member. And I noticed in this next draft, it's parents and guardians, which is much broader. But I'm wondering, we did have a lot of conversation about the word family, because that means, grandparent, auntie, like it broadens it up out a lot more than just parents and guardians if we want to go big inclusive. But that was just something we talked about before. I'd love to have another conversation about that.
And I would say I'm definitely supportive of family. I think I mentioned last time that we're going to talk a lot about family engagement next year. And so either way, I'd be supportive of.
Mr. Doran?
I think in terms of when we talk about parent-guardian representation on a committee, I think that's different than family. A family member can be the guardian, but I look at that as having the voice of who's going to feel the immediate impact through their child by what that committee does. And so I really support the idea of, instead of parent engagement, family engagement. But in terms of that stakeholder position, having that immediate impact voice, I think, is very important, and rather than just opening it up to any family member.
Ms. Marati?
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Doran, for that perspective. But I will say that there are many students whose immediately impacted family member is not a parent. It's another family member still immediately impacted by decisions made by the board.
Mr. Doran?
Through the chair, just a point of clarification. So I see the guardian piece as that, I think that's important to do parent-guardian because we do have guardians who are not the parent. And so I really like that change to parent-guardian. But I think it's that they have a little bit more relationship than just, yeah, I'm grandpa coming in, but I don't really have that control, so.
Mr. Burgess?
I appreciate that discussion. It's getting me thinking, and I do wonder if there are sometimes people who are not necessarily a legal guardian, but are filling that role as well, and if we would preclude them from, you know, unintentionally preclude them from serving by using this language.
Mr. Doran?
As I was saying that, I was thinking guardian somewhat loosely in that because we do have many people who serve in the capacity of guardian that whom actually do not have that legal title. And I guess I would suggest not getting so specific to say that it has to be legal, just leave it as guardian. And because I think that's practicality in our community. I know many coming to mind right away, several people in that. So.
And
Mr. Burgess?
I wonder if we could, and maybe this is a question for legal actually, but if including a definition of guardian for the purposes of this particular bylaw might be, or AR, might be useful, because we could specifically say that we mean it more broadly than legal guardian, and that might help fix this. But just an idea, throwing that out there. Maybe a question for administration.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how that works in practice with a separate definition, you know, just for this individual policy versus the entire policy manual. So I'd need to think a little bit on that and probably seek legal's counsel on how we might thread that needle.
Mr. Doran, then Ms. Marati.
And through the chair, just reflecting on the idea, I wouldn't beg the question, especially for the committee. I am not aware of any issues that has come from that. If we ask for a definition, I think it'll become much more restrictive than our community practice and situations are. So I would be hesitant about going that route. I would just leave it parent or guardian. We don't ask them to prove their parency when they do this. We don't define what parent is. I would leave the guardian the same in this context.
Ms. Marati.
Thanks. I'm just going to say one last thing just to make sure that my opinion is clear. With the federal and state investment in family engagement currently and coming out down the pipeline, I have no problem expanding this to family members. If someone is not their guardian, but they're, like I said, a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle that want to be involved, I say more the merrier. I think everybody's impacted, the entire community is impacted, and I hear the great conversation and perspectives being stated, and yet I still feel firmly that family engagement is going to be a very hot topic and very important topic for a very long, in the coming future and for a while, and rightfully so, and I think that expanding it to meet that would only benefit the district and our decision making.
So I'm just going to add one backtracking to the Janus decision, all that. I wonder when you bring that up with our legal again, if mentioning that we've now allowed anyone in the Fairbanks area to be on a committee even if they work for the district, if that might alleviate some of that burden. So there is a way for them to participate. They're no longer precluded.
I think that would probably alleviate a lot of the concerns. I think it was that potentially not having the opportunity to serve, that was the concern, and so I think that probably gets at that. All right. I wanted to bring the board's attention to the first page, the standing board committee charges. A lot of these were pulled off, these descriptions were pulled off of the websites for individual committees, and then a little bit of language work was done around them. I think we heard in the last work session that there might be some interest in putting these descriptions within AR. I guess it would be my recommendation that they stand alone outside of AR, but would remain on the website for committee descriptions and then certainly for applications to describe what each committee is. I believe the only committee that didn't have kind of a robust paragraph on the website was the policy committee, so we added a little bit more language around that. So wanted the board to look at the descriptions we came up with, not necessarily something that the board needs to reach consensus around unless you want to put it in AR, but wanted to have that in front of you before we moved on.
Mr. Doran?
Clarification, make sure what we're looking at the standing board committee charges,
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're ready, I've got a couple questions or observations.
Yep, I'm ready.
Go ahead, Mr. Doran.
Okay. On the budget committee, I think there needs to be a phrase in there that they're providing input to the budget. They provide, in the first sentence, they provide input to the budgeting process. They don't provide the process. That's an administrative thing. In the third line, there's also a reference is goal-driven. And I have a real problem with the word driven in that. That it's should be in accord or with the goals of the district. And they should use those goals, but they're goal guided. Something I just find it very when we're absolutely driven and what the understanding of that is. It's and I guess I come out of the bias of when they talk about data driven versus data use. And you should not be driven by it. You should be, that's not the determining factor, but you should be using those things. So those were the two things that I felt in the budget was problematic.
Mr. Burgess?
Yeah, I hear Mr. Doran's concern there, and on the goal-driven, what I think I would like to see is more specificity in where we're deriving those goals from. So it would, be this district strategic plan. I would think we could just put that in there, and that might address your concerns as well, Mr. Doran. And I also agree on the first sentence that adding input would improve that description and make it more accurate.
Ms. Marati, but I want to give the board an idea. Since this isn't exactly policy, it's wordsmithing something from our website, I'm wondering if it might be a better use of our time for each of us to take this, wordsmith what we think it should say, send it to CARM, have CARM send it out to everybody, and then we find a middle ground, because I want us to be out of here by 8, and I want us to get through our policy.
Works for me.
I like it.
Okay, so everybody's got homework. Ms. Dillard.
Thank you, President Hardy. Yeah, so I did take all of the feedback from the last work session and did the best I can to make some edits, and then I was gone early in the week. And Dr. Minor got information from legal, later. So I would still like to go through maybe page by page just to make sure that I'm on point with some of the edits, and then we'll know what we're good with and then what needs to be worked on. But I was thinking the same thing, President Hardy, as far as the committee charges go, that maybe that could be on the job of the actual committee chair, because this was very quickly done last week, just taking information offline, just so you know. So as far as page 1 goes, I think this is pretty straightforward. So this is the policy, 9130. Page 1, we asked to take out the line about the legislative committee because some changes were made with that, and then also I believe it was redundant to language in the AR. There were some suggestions from Mr. Burgess about to add to the language about soliciting applications for committee volunteer memberships. I did change parent guardian language everywhere. I guess I will want to hear back ultimately if you want that to be family, or maybe it could be parent caregiver. But I don't know if the goal is to change that language from where it's going to be parent guardian throughout most of policy. So I'm not sure about that. And do you have any questions about page 1? Does page 1 look okay? Okay. So then going to page 2, which is the beginning of the AR, I added just some minor. No? Okay. Is the quorum language okay? Did I capture that correctly? Okay.
Mr. Doran.
I just want to note that I think you captured the sense. I think that it should be a majority, but I still do.
Okay. And we talked about order applications are received, and I know that is going to be follow-up with legal. I did hear, I think mostly from you, Ms. Marati, about wanting to ensure that parents could fill empty community member spots, and I wasn't sure if we wanted that to go both ways, like if there was an empty spot in either group. And so the language I landed on here was parent guardian and at-large community members may be assigned vacant positions in either membership group. So I'm not sure if that's where you were going with that.
Ms. Marati.
Thank you through the chair, Ms. Dillard. Thank you for listening to me and putting that into writing. I did not, my intent for this language was not to have it go both ways. It was just that for family members or parent guardian, whatever we land on, can serve in the community member position. But I don't know I don't recall what the rest of the board's opinion was on that, but thank you for asking.
I have one of my nitpicky grammar things. It's an Oxford
Go ahead,
comma
Mr.
thing. I'm an Oxford comma proponent. And I was just on the sentence that says the board committees are, and then lists them, I would just include a comma after family engagement to make it clear that it's not family engagement and policy committee, but those are two separate things.
I love Oxford commas.
That's not an Oxford comma, that's like a specific.
Is it not?
It is, but also, and also.
Mr. Doran.
So then put a comma after diversity also.
Got it. Thank you.
So if I can address, I think a family member right now can apply for anything. They could be an at-large.
No, well,
Yeah, they're,
So my understanding from our discussions last and then in past discussions, since our AR and policy was more vague, it was being left to the discretion of the president as to whether or not a parent or guardian could fill the role of a community member. So the intent of adding this language is to be not vague, but intentional in stating that a family member can, in fact, fill that role so that it's no longer left to the discretion of the president. Mr. Doran.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Okay, parent guardian could fill an at-large. A employee could fill an at-large. A family member who is not a parent or guardian can fill an at-large. Or, and that's present day. I could be on if I wasn't on the board, I could apply for an at-large position. Even though I'm a grandparent, I'm not a parent or guardian. So we have the I'm just want to clarify that we have, family members can do that as it is now and will continue to be able to do that. Okay.
My one piece would be if we're changing the committee chair reserves the right to disqualify, could we change, because we talked about this, if through legal, put in there a committee member. In each place it says the applicant. If the committee member presents a barrier to the charge of the committee, any decision to disqualify a committee member shall be made in agreement with the board president.
So all of that will change, and we haven't gotten to update that with legal. So that first part won't even be there, and then the second part will provide updated language on.
Yeah, I figured I just meant it might be easy.
Yep.
Can you repeat that real quickly, just so that I have the notes in case?
It was just changing applicant to committee member. That
Okay.
way it implies that it's already on the committee, and then we can write those standards.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Marati, then Mr. Doran.
I just wanted to share my lack of support for the possible addition. I understand those that have been and are currently our board presidents have this a need to check the work of board members sometimes. But this, as a committee chair, it's your responsibility to facilitate and run that committee. And I don't agree that a board president needs to agree with the committee chair's decision if they can show that they have presented, that the member being disqualified presents a barrier. So I don't, my opinion only is to not add that.
Mr. Doran, does it relate to this, or can we go to Mr. Burgess and then circle back to your question? Because you both raised your hands, but I wasn't sure if
Well,
Mr.
you can-
Burgess's
he can
was
go first.
directly.
I can,
Mr. Burgess.
Okay. I agree with Ms. Marati. I think that it should be the chair's responsibility. And as we work on, how to determine whether someone can be disqualified, we can make it clear that they can't just do it for no reason, that they have to have documentation or of why they're making that decision.
Dr. Meinert.
Ms. Marati, would you be interested in language that's, I guess, softened it a bit, that said that disqualify an applicant, and all this language will change, but maybe made in consultation rather than agreement? And the only reason I say consultation is I'm thinking either the board chair or the superintendent might want to be, or might need to be involved in that conversation if legal guidance is needed. I do think there's certain situations where, a sitting board member or the chair of that committee could disqualify somebody, and it opens up the district to liability for removing them for grounds that didn't meet this legal standard. And so that's why I guess I would advocate for maybe in consultation with either the board president or the superintendent.
Ms. Marati, then Ms. Burnett.
I appreciate that, but I don't see the difference between consultation and agreement. I still think it should be the committee chair's decision, as long as, like Mr. Burgess said, the committee chair is following the standards that are provided, then consultation, in my opinion, isn't needed. Because if it's following the standards that are already reviewed by legal, then it's a legal decision and should be able to be made by the chair, committee chair.
Ms. Burnett?
I was trying to look this up and see what our wording in our policy or AR may be, and I can't seem to find it. Do we have one? We do not.
Just
So,
attendance.
so then my follow-up to this would be, maybe that's a question for legal on what that should be. I also am kind of not in favor of it being the board president, but I can also see legal reasons behind needing that extra step just to verify that maybe it's not an overreaction possibly, so I can understand that. So maybe it is the superintendent that, I mean, considering the superintendent oversees the whole school district operations anyway.
Mr. Doran?
Okay. To be clear, we're not talking about the applicant being disqualified. So it only affects somebody who is a committee member. They've already been seated. I think it would be, one way I would look at this is to say that it's not solely the committee chair's decision, or even in consultation, I would turn it to the committee, that the chair could bring to their attention. And the thing we have right now are the continued membership is contingent upon, rather than saying we're disqualifying, it's more the expectation. We have in practice now that if they miss 50%, they could be removed. At the same time, they might stay if that absence is for an emergency type of situation that is added up, and their contribution to the committee is received by the committee. So I see it being presented to the committee because they're the ones who actually determine whether that person's presence is disruptive or not. If their absence, we're really not seeing that. More than whether a person, I perceive it as one thing or another. It gives that broader perspective. And I think it accentuates the fact that the committee is working together. So I have real concerns about this. I also, this is done in the negative. I would think it's more to our benefit to do it more in the positive about attendance. We have those standards, attendance, and and then also, we can have the wording in terms of a constructive conversation. That's there, civil discourse, whatever. That should be there for the committees.
Mr. Burgess?
I would actually support drafting those as, making it, rather than being about disqualifying, I think I would support saying this is the expectations and making it in the positive. Not quite sure how I feel about the committee itself making the decision to eject a member. I think that could be problematic, and particularly because committee members are not elected officials, they're not held to the same kinds of standards. It could potentially result in unwanted drama, I think, and be a detriment to the function of the committee. So I think I'm leaning towards leaving the decision with the board chair. And if we do have very clear expectations, I think that would help. And then we could add a statement of, The expectation, if the chair is going to remove a member, would be to get legal consultation or with the administration, I would support, I think. But I do not think that it should be, that a committee chair's decision to remove a member who's behaving badly should be held by the president, should be prevented by the president. I think that that could also, you know, it's a balance of power thing, I think. Yeah.
Ms. Burnett.
Okay, I think we're getting bogged down on this one thing, and I know Dr. Minor had already said that we got to seek counsel with legal over it, so I'd be in favor of moving on so we can get through our stuff.
Ms. Marati.
I agree. I think we've had a lot of discussion, and I appreciate the discussion. I just wanted to clarify through the chair. Mr. Burgess, when you said the decision should be made by the board chair, did you mean the committee chair or the board chair?
Thank you. Committee chair, yes.
Oh, thanks.
So, Dr. Minor, if you wouldn't mind, I was going to suggest that too. So we're all in agreement. Taking that whole section back to legal and getting maybe what they also think would be the appropriate legally justifiable way.
That's the plan.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
An email's already sent, so hopefully we'll have that.
And I've taken all the feedback I've heard so far so that we can add those to the ideas and questions. Okay, moving on. Bottom of page 5 was a slight rewrite to how the report would be, committee reports would be provided to the school board. And before that, lots of number changes, but I'm pretty sure that I got them right. I hope.
Mr. Doran?
Just a question, the expectation of via written reports as appropriate, that there are times when the committees are specifically recommending, let's say, curriculum materials or policy moving forward, or budget type of thing. But a lot of times there may be interim reports, which we address, I think, somewhere here, you know, at the board meeting, and it's just an oral. We don't need to do that. Not the expectation that every report be written. And I think it's okay with the writing as appropriate, but I just want to check that understanding.
Yes, and that, oh, sorry.
Ms. Dillard, why don't you go ahead and then Ms. Marati?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know what the practice looks like, honestly, but as appropriate was the language that existed in the policy or the AR already, so I kept that, but I'm not sure what the regular practice is.
Maybe to clear that up, the word written report can be changed to written recommendation or something else so that it delineates the, what is that, on page 1, I think, or, yeah, page 1, last sentence, talks about a committee report on the agenda, which is, like Mr. Doran said, different than the written report as the recommendation from the committee.
Mr. Doran?
I like that suggestion to use recommendations because a lot of times the committees may not have a recommendation. Their meeting may be, you know, leading towards a recommendation, but and it doesn't require a report as such.
Thank you. Top of page 6, this was discussed but not too in-depth, so I wasn't sure where the board.
Ms. Burnett?
Sorry, yes, super fast. This is actually one I had been looking at. So just right at the top, actually, committee member applications and assignments will be conducted in October. While I get that that's probably the way that we have it written here, that's not how it happens. It's November. So if we could just change that to November, that'd be great, because that's what it goes at. Election is certified at the end of October, which means we see our new seats at the beginning of November.
And just to make sure that I understand that correctly, so this would be a change from how the other members are appointed, correct? Because currently that happens at the beginning, or in the spring at the beginning. So this would be a change to that happening in November? That's the understanding?
So new board members are seated the very last week of October, often on like Halloween. And then the new president is elected at that same time. And then the new president, usually sometime when they're down at that conference, AASB, decides who the new chairs of the committees will be. So the new chairs of committees is done in November.
Okay. Okay.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you. I'm a little bit wary of assigning a month. I think it makes sense to try and group it all together. What I guess my concern is that, you know, if we say that this happens only in November, and we don't use the word only, but, you know, if we're saying it happens in November, but someone resigns in January, do we need to include something, you know, like an exception to that rule to make sure that we can replace that member?
My follow-on to that would be, would it make more sense to just say at the beginning of the school year? And because we were going to go to a common application anyways, so we'll start soliciting applications, but we might not tell them until November. Or if we're going first come, first serve, then I guess it really doesn't matter. We just start collecting people applying if the goal is to fill committees. And then that way, when a board member is changed over into that committee, they're ready to go and there's enough members. Ms. Marati.
No, because I thought you noticed.
Sorry, Mr. Doran.
I share the concern about putting a specific number, I mean, or a specific month in it. I did want to see something that it could be on a rolling basis, so if a vacancy arose, you would be able to fill it. If you didn't have all positions filled by November 15th or October 15th, you'd want to have some leeway to say, hey, we still need somebody from, as we've done and we've announced them from our board meetings. I think that it is, for October was kind of, I mean, it gives a little bit of time for doing a solicitation at the beginning of the year and such. I don't see a problem with it, which committee chair is doing it, especially if we're avoiding disqualifications up front. That, you know, you're assuming everyone's going to follow those expectations, going to be there, bring their voice to the table. So I don't really care who's the committee chair at any given time, and because it's the people we learn to work with. And the committee chair is primarily a facilitator of that conversation, in my opinion. So November becomes really late. There are, you know, because it has been times when the board president hasn't made the assignments until later, significantly later than November, so over time. So so I'd favor, I think we do need to get a good clarification of when members' terms end when they begin, when they end, and we are not really clear on that. Yeah, we say 2 years, we don't really identify when that starts and, when it ends. So if someone isn't appointed until January, are they there for 2 years from, 1 to 2 years after that? Or if they join in October, it ends then? I mean, we just haven't delved into that. So.
Ms. Marati.
I have a couple things, if that's okay. I just wanted to provide the recommendation from the ad hoc committees on committees from 2022? It was recommended change to appointment timeline, recommend that the board only accepts applications in the month of October. And to Ms. Burnett's comment about October versus November, it would be accepting them in October to then, once the chair appointments are selected or completed, then the chair would have the applications to review. Board chair appoints committee chairs after board reorganization. Committee chair selects community members, and board chair appoints committee chairs. Committee chair appointments added to the board consent agenda at the next available regular board meeting. If applicants are not appointed, their applications will be held for future appointments. So that was the recommendation, if anybody is interested in that. I also, I hear what Mr. Doran was saying about when the terms begin and end. On all the committees that I have been on, the practice has been, and it gets really confusing because the practice has been that the term starts at their first meeting. And then, so if their first meeting was in April, then their term ends the following April. And what that does is it means that we lose a committee member, one committee member every month or a couple months or so, because they're all staggered and in different timelines. So it has been the practice. It's a little confusing. And what the ad hoc committee on committees is suggesting is that everybody starts in October. That means everybody's term ends in October, or everybody starts in November, term ends in November, is what we were suggesting at that time.
Mr. Burgess.
So to kind of sum up what I'm hearing, I think that, or I guess an idea to address these various things that Mr. Doran and Ms. Marati are saying. Rather than setting a specific time when members are appointed or even accepting applications, we just say a term begins on this date and ends on that same date, the day before, the following year. And that way, we still have the flexibility to add members later, at different times a year if we lose a committee member. But we have it clearly set that, they're not serving an extra few months. They're basically filling out the rest of the term that's available. Just like what happened with if one of us resigned or needed to be replaced. So that's, if that model works for everyone, that's what I would suggest.
Mr. Doran.
Listening to the things, and I know I was advocating in terms of raising the question. I didn't advocate a solution for it, term. But listening to, we might have, if I'm on for a year, no matter when I started and I come off for a year, what it does do in actuality is gives continuity within the committee. If we do, say, okay, the term is October to October, then potentially everybody could be off and you have no continuity. And so you've given me food for thought in terms of saying, well, the way we're doing it is kind of a natural, you're on for a year, you might be on for 2 years, but we don't have everybody changing And the difference between us as elected board members, we have assigned seats that then rotate, so we don't have the whole board changing at one time. And so the way we've been doing it, you're on for a year, and that rolling applications might actually serve us better.
Ms. Marati?
And I will say, I don't mind either what the recommendation was or what we're talking about now. I see benefits in both sides. To what Mr. Doran is suggesting, would it benefit us through this policy? So for example, FPA representative appointed annually, 1-year term, should we add from the date of appointment or from the date of first meeting to clarify that? And then by FPA president, 2-term limit. Sorry, so in summary, just adding the words from date of, and then a word after that, after term, year term.
Mr. Burgess, then Mr. Doran.
Yeah, and I would, I'd support that. But my suggestion, though, so that we don't have to add it to every line, would just to be define what a term is ahead of that.
Mr. Doran.
I'm going to suggest that that first line there, committee member applications and assignments will be on a rolling basis, and that be inserted before parent, guardian, and at large. The others are all appointed. And I think annually, I would look at that as school term, because people may change over the summer for most of those. That includes the administrative staff member is done annually. I mean, we do our board ones. Chair is appointed annually in November, generally speaking. But the only application, none of those others apply. The only ones who apply are for the parent, guardian, and at large. And so if that was moved down, except on a rolling basis, then we'd have that. And we could, the intent for the administration is to do a real solicitation, that was first couple of weeks of school. And that we also can know if somebody's moved on the committee, those type of things. But that's the only place that it applies.
Wondering, same vein, but still leaving it up there and changing it to committee member application and appointments, because that covers everything else, will be conducted on a rolling basis. And then adding what Mr. Burgess said, a term begins on the day of a member's first meeting. And then that outlines it for everybody. Mr. Burgess.
I just want to preface this with that I don't actually have a strong opinion. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But as far as pros and cons with having it on a rolling basis, I think that the continuity piece that Mr. Doran mentioned is a big pro. I'm a little concerned, though, that if I'm thinking about like on the budget committee or the curriculum committee, where we have specific goals that we're trying to accomplish every year. If we end up replacing a member in the middle of that process because someone resigned, that's good, we want that person there, but then they would have to leave again in the middle of the next year's process potentially, and that could be disruptive to the committee's work. So,
Ms. Marati.
Yeah, I had the exact same thought as Mr. Burgess, but only specifically about the budget committee, because I think that, and maybe the legislative committee, but that's already being suggested as a committee of the whole. So really, it's just the budget committee, I think, that has like a super specific timeline that would be impacted by this, negatively impacted, I agree, by this change. And I don't know how we should remedy that right at this moment, but something we should probably think about.
Mr. Doran?
I'm thinking in terms of the parent guardian at large, those are 2-year terms. And so you have that. What I found we did have on the budget committee this year, and I know every year is different, but we had a number of vacancies that came up where somebody left in the middle of those conversations, other people joined us. And on my perspective on the budget committee was, it was more important to have as many voices at the table as possible. The only one where I let it go was to say, our very last meeting where we were making the recommendations, I didn't look to push to get a vacancy filled by that point. But the other times we were able to get people at the table, and even though some left, we got some new voices out there, and I think it was beneficial. So I don't have a problem with people coming in and joining the conversation.
So, given that we've heard that the legislative committee and the budget committee, their work is really limited to that year specifically, it's that year's budgets, it's that year's legislative priorities, I would suggest that we carve those two out and say that members' terms in those committees expire at the end of the committee's work for that year. So then nobody leaves in the middle of a committee just because they started in the middle of committee the year prior. Ms. Marati?
Thanks. I love that. I would just suggest that maybe for the budget committee, and it could be for both, that it's school year based, because the date that the budget committee's work expires is to be determined, because we don't know, the budget committee still may ask or choose to come back together before the end of this year, because there's still so much work to be done, and until that changes, which would be a great reason to change it, I think maybe the school year actually may align. I'm pointing at you, isn't it? Fiscal year too, that would be great. Yeah. That would be July 1 through June 30.
Mr. Burgess?
I would, I'm thinking about including the curriculum committee as another one that could be carved out. I guess I'd appreciate, through the chair, the administration's feedback on that.
Yeah, that was the one other committee that I would suggest as well, given there are some concrete timelines and some expertise that members kind of build up as they're working through it, and it could be disruptive of the committee if they leave midterm.
Mr. Doran?
I keep going back in my mind, what's the problem we're solving? And I think we've basically been operating reasonably, reasonably well. And I think that we can hammer this and we can make exceptions. There are going to be changes in the committee. People are going to leave for one reason or another. People are going to be available to come on for one reason or another. It's generally worked quite well as far as this aspect of the committees in terms for the last 7 years. So I'm inclined to leave it the way it is. That's my suggestion.
I guess my one piece is we did hear from members that it was an issue if somebody leaves in the middle of a committee's work, that it might be something worth fixing while we're going through this process anyways. But Mr. Doran?
Okay. And I don't mean this to be argumentative. I'm just going to say is that people will leave in the middle for a variety of reasons. They could get elected to the board. They could have a job change. They could have, any number of reasons.
Ms. Marati?
Thanks. Just for clarification, I believe this may have come from the recommendation of the ad hoc committee on committees, and then board discussion after that. So there was identified as a problem to be solved, and then it was further identified that the problem was the solution to the problem may negatively impact specific committees that are on a specific schedule. So to answer, through the chair, to answer Mr. Doran's question, there's actually two problems to be solved in this discussion.
So at this point, I think we've probably discussed the committee thing enough for right now. We have Mr. DeGraw here, who he came to discuss Article 3, and I think in respect for his time, we should move on to Article 3. Or, yeah, it does say Article.
Thank you, President Hardy. Article 3 is its own packet. I also have it up on the board. We're going to start with page 1, which is policy 3235. This is a policy that we created to capture our policy 428.4. So this is all of our language, except that there is a big difference here in wanting to make the threshold $100,000 for grants that must be approved by the board. And just to clarify, current policy is that all grants are formally approved by the board in our policy 428.4.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, so I have a couple of questions, but clarify for me why a new policy?
Yes, so we copied what Mat-Su did. So this Anchorage did not have this policy, but Mat-Su did use this numbering. ASB has a policy that is that's basically donations, but it's called grants, bequests, and gifts, I believe. And so it really does mostly focus just on the donations process, and it captured our 1156 donations policy perfectly. So we wanted to have a policy that was specific to grants and separate from the donations process. And so we created the number, we copied Mat-Su, who had done the same, created the number to plug in our policy language.
Okay, follow.
Mr. Doran, then Ms. Marati.
Okay, so the 428.4 is our policy, but it's not grants.
Our policy is called, it's under a revenue section, and it's called
Right.
supplemental funding.
Okay. Put me back in the queue, please.
Ms. Marati?
Where did the 100,000 come from?
That was a number that it kind of aligned with, I think, what would be a good threshold for most of the grants that were coming through to raise that threshold so that there was a good number that are lower, that wouldn't require board approval, but it wasn't from a specific example somewhere else.
Mr. DeGraw?
Yeah, just to add to that, this is kind of a common theme that is going to be applicable to many of the policies that we're going to talk about in Chapter 3, is just a significantly diminished capacity due to reduced staffing in many of the areas. So grants is heavily impacted by the accounting department and their ability to process not only the application process, but also the financial monitoring as you go through the multiple years of a grant. It requires financial reporting, accounting, tracking, and reporting. And so a common theme here is just when the administrative services department has to do legwork and paperwork and reporting to have the board approve every single grant. Yeah, we're kind of just trying to shoot for a scenario where the board would still acknowledge and see every grant that comes through the district, but just to try to reduce the administrative burden of having the board officially approve every single grant that passes through our doors. So, and that, again, that theme is going to be applicable in many of the chapter or policies that we'll go over in chapter 3.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, that was one of my major areas of question. I have real questions about 100,000. I like the thing about involving anything that has staff positions. Ostensibly, eventually we would be picking those up. I am really concerned and appreciative of the amount of work, but I'm not sure that the amount of work to bring it to the board is problematic. It comes on our consent agenda under current practice. It is generally it's a one-sheet summary, which is basically taking out of the abstract from the grant. I am aware of sometimes we've had great conversations of if a teacher applies for a $5,000 grant. How small a grant is a teacher limited on, type of thing, and we've had some guidelines on that over the years. If the grant is something that the district feels is beneficial going through that whole application process, that work is already done, and then it's just their summary piece that comes that says, yes, we got this. I think that $100,000 is an extremely high number, which in several number of grants, the expectation is we might be picking them up afterwards. Some grants are just one time, and again, it's one sheet or less. So I want to be respectful of the amount of time we ask for people, but I think it's also really important what we as a district are committing to, and I think that 100,000 is a extremely high threshold.
Ms. Marati?
I looked up the policy that the board approved for budget implementation transfer of funds, policy 425.1, where we explicitly state that the board must approve transfers in excess of 100,000. So we've had this discussion in this scenario before, and I love consistency, so I would suggest I appreciate the 100,000 threshold, and because it's in line with other things that we have under our finance policies.
Ms. Burnett?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not against it either. I appreciate consistency is key, and we go over this often. I also appreciate, having taking stress off of staff when we can, especially as we're cutting more and more positions lately. My only question or request maybe on my behalf is just if this grant or if this has to do with a position that somehow are let known. Just because, we do handle the budget and sometimes we do get questions on positions and stuff. So if it's grant funding tied to somebody that we're going to be moving one fund from another fund, that'd be great.
And to be clear, that's how the policy reads, and it's in addition to, so sometimes within the district, there'll be a transfer of positions from grants to grants, and that wouldn't necessarily qualify, but if we're adding another FTE to the district, that would come to the board, even if under the threshold.
Yeah, just to add, just to concur with that, the way we're reading it and the intent is $100,000 or a $50,000 grant that involves a staff position, some kind of FTE addition, that would also be approved by the board.
Mr. Burgess, then Mr. Doran.
Through the chair to the administration, I'm wondering if you have any idea of the average size of a grant that you would see? Or most
do not.
typical, not necessarily calculated average?
I do not, but I can get that information and we'll get it to the board.
Mr. Doran.
Okay. I suspect that most of our grants are over the 100,000. But we sometimes do get smaller ones. We've gotten them for safety, security. We've gotten them for some different projects. Through the chair, Mr. DeGraw, you had mentioned, referenced acknowledged by the board or stuff as opposed to approval, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more. How we're doing that, since it's already, I mean, we make it an official action, but it's within the consent agenda. We're typically not discussing them, so I want to see what you're thinking on that, and I might have a follow-up based on.
So what I have been informed is that there's two different layers of forms that are prepared on each grant to be presented to the board, and that's where the pileup of work is coming up. And to feed, there might be some that are relatively straightforward as far as copy and paste, but I know there is work that has to go into those layers of reporting to the board. So, you know, we have two grant people that are specifically dedicated to grants, and then we have support that's required from the accounting department in addition to that on the financial side. And yeah, basically, and I can get more information back. I can certainly bring more information out, more details and specifics on specifically the items that are time consuming tasks that are starting to put pressure on reduced staff here in the building. I have that as an item.
Mr. Doran.
Follow-up. Yes, and I know at one point the board used to do kind of and approve the going after a grant and approve the receipt of the actual receipt of the grant. And I believe we can maybe streamline those a little bit so it comes once. I think it is really important that they come to the board, that we're cognizant of them. But if we can streamline that process, I think that's important. I see this category as being very different from our allowing the superintendent to make a within budget check or transfer up to 100,000, because that's money we've actually already approved within the budget process or such. Grants are things that maybe often enough are rolling in, and they're adding to our budget. So I do think there's a certain financial accountability on our part to approve those basically additions to our budget. But I am not in favor of the $100,000 designation.
Ms. Marati, then I'm putting myself in the queue.
Just a real quick perspective. I've been on the board for almost 6 years now, and I've never seen a grant not approved by the board.
So this seems to be something that we've talked about quite a few times, both up at the dais and even here inside our work sessions. And what I'm continuously hearing from our administration, and that I've heard, that we've slashed our accounting department to levels that are not sustainable. We've just approved in our current recommended budget a $500,000 cut from administration. We have our leaders who oversee their employees telling us they have too much on their plates and our policies are hindering them from doing their jobs effectively. Our job is to enable them to successfully do theirs and not get bogged down in trying to micromanage the people we entrust. So I am, I've looked through the rest of the packet, very much in support. I trust that they have done their work and brought this before us to approve if it needs to go to 100,000 or 200,000, that is not done lightly, and that is eliminating extra things. We keep talking about the legislature giving unfunded mandates and giving extra work that we have to do. This board does it too, and we don't have to. We can listen to our people and give them the leeway to take some stuff off their plates. We have to, because we're not getting funding to give them more people. Mr. DeGraw.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, President Hardy. And just to add on to that, just for some context for board members, a lot of these policies are centered around our purchasing and procurement department and activities, and there's a tremendous desire to follow policy. And given that, there's angst now in the department because they're seeing a consistently reduced ability to keep up with policy, to your point, President Hardy. And so the desire is tremendously there to maximize, specifically to our purchasing department, to maximize district dollars. Obviously, they're more and more precious every year given our financial constraints and our realities that we are very aware of. So there's a huge desire to be able to comply with board policy. And so that's the drive here, not to have less checks and balances in our system, not to have a less rigorous process of appropriately spending our dollars. Just a huge desire to be able to comply with policy and to be able to do well for the district.
Mr. Doran.
Just want to make it clear that I have no question about staff trying to do the best with our dollars, working to their fullest. And I don't want to leave any implication that I don't listen to staff feedback. I think it's very important. At the same time, I think I have certain responsibilities as a board member in terms of the fiduciary in this category, accountability. I think that if there are other things, I personally don't see a one-page periodic deal. It has not been problematic, but I think it's really important for our approval process of finances and knowledge of them. And I am very concerned that this will lead to, could lead, not that it will, but that it could lead to gaps in our understanding of the financial picture of the diocese, of the district, and what we are committed to. But I do want to make it absolutely clear there should be no implication that I am disregarding staff input. And I am very concerned about what we are putting on their plates, what we continue on their plates with fewer people, and that's not just in administration in this building, but throughout our district.
Ms. Burnett, then Ms. Marati.
Thank you. I don't see us going any further than arguing over a number, which we do a lot. So I'm very thankful that Mr. DeGraw is here and would like to move on with the rest of our packet here.
Ms. Marati.
Thanks. I want to say that and with all due respect, our lack of funding cannot and does not reduce or eliminate our responsibility to hold our district accountable. That being said, our admin has proven that we can trust them with $100,000, and I support this policy, but that has nothing to do with our funding, in my opinion, my personal opinion.
Ms. Dillard, have we provided you any clarity?
My question would be, is this going to move forward as is to be discussed formally? Okay.
Ms. Marati, did you? So, am I seeing a consensus of the board? Looks like 4 members are okay with this moving forward.
can't do a count, but I just want to, that I do not agree.
Thank you. The next policy is 3270. We brought this forward for discussion also because of the dollar amount change. So our policy 428.11 has a threshold of $2,000, and we wanted to move that up to $10,000 for board approval in selling school district property.
Again, just for information for the board, that again, we're not setting aside normal procedure of disposing of goods and materials. We're simply increasing the threshold. $2,000 we very easily surpass. It's basically almost everything that we are going to dispose of would need to be approved by the board, and so these are items that also help with speeding up processes and allowing the administration to effectively and in a timely fashion take care of disposal of goods and materials.
Ms. Burnett.
I think Ms. Marati was first.
Ms. Marati.
Thanks. I like this policy. It's worded very well. My only concern, and maybe Admin can help me with this, we have experienced a bit of a pickle with sold property not being disposed of properly. And so what can we do in policy to maybe prevent that from happening again?
Could you refresh my memory, Ms. Marati, on?
I don't want to. It's really embarrassing.
I pick up what you're saying. I mean, I don't know that it would be best in policy, but there's definitely procedures within each individual department that have been cleaned up, and Mr. DeGraw and I can chat about that. But I know what you're talking about, and since then, certainly there's been updated procedures in place to not have that specific incident happen again.
Go ahead, Ms. Marati.
Okay, with that knowledge and knowing that, then I do support this policy. It's great.
Ms. Burnett.
I just wanted to throw my support behind it too. And I thank the administration for doing what they can to resell whatever that we can to help bring some funds back to our district, even if it's just minuscule.
Mr. Doran.
I don't necessarily have a concern about, 10,000 was, well, that's a pretty significant item that we're getting rid of. And maybe administration can help refresh my mind, or other board members. I don't really remember a lot of surplus stuff coming to the board. I think there's a notice we've gotten information in terms of that there's a surplus sale going to be held, but in terms of items with these values, vehicles, those types of things might, but I'm trying to think how many things are really above, and so I went, 2,000 maybe too small. I was thinking 5,000 is 10,000. I mean, that's a significant enough piece of technology, or and not computers. None of them are worth that by the time we get rid of them. So maybe just enlighten me a little bit how often this comes up.
Yeah, I would have to, I don't want to speak out of turn. That might be something I need to get information on from our purchasing department. But yeah, I mean, individual items more than 10,000 would be, I would think relatively rare, mainly because we, for example, our FMD department, we don't dispose of things because we're not on a regular basis replacing them. So.
Can you give an example of 2,000, like over that?
Over 2,000, it would be like a vehicle, nothing in the technology world. Be very rare. So one example might be, we're looking at disposing of some of our more industrial commercial printing equipment in the print shop that was closed a couple of years ago. So that could be an example of something more than 2,000, so we have a couple of pieces of printers that are significant in nature down there. Yeah, not a lot.
Mr. Doran?
So the 2,000, yeah, not a lot, 5,000. 10,000, I mean,
Yeah, so those printers specifically could be, and I don't know, that's why I don't want to speak out of turn. They could easily be over 2,000. I would venture to guess
Right.
they are. Vehicles would be a common item that would be over 2,000. But again, we haven't done that in years because we're not replacing them regularly.
but 5,000 or
Oh,
10,000.
yeah. The vehicle's probably not over 5,000, no. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
I think the question is, do we leave it at 10,000, or picking up that Mr. Doran would like to have that moved to 5,000. Is there a strong consensus from the board? I'm fine with 10. Mr. Burgess?
I'm okay with how it's written presently.
Thank you. The next policy on page 3 is 3,300 expenditures expending authority. So we spent a lot of time talking about this number and ultimately did get word back from legal on this number. And so I'll let Dr. Meinert speak to that or any questions to that. But just as far as how our policies read right now, purchasing and contracting requires, it's that $100,000 threshold for board approval. And which also aligns with bids or the bidding number, what has to go to formal bid versus informal bid. And so we'll see that in the next policy, unless otherwise exempt. And there are quite a few exemptions that, that come from federal regulations, that certain things over 100,000 do not need to go to formal bid. So this is moving that threshold up to 200,000 from a $100,000 policy in practice currently.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, I'm not in favor of moving it up, and for two reasons. One, it was not that long ago, and that we raised it to the 100,000. I think it's only about a year. The 200,000 catches my eye. We're talking close to $250,000. And in terms of our budgets, we are watching those expenditures picking up hundreds of thousands. I'm very comfortable at this point with 100,000 since that change was there. I have not seen any problems with it. But the 200,000, I think, is, given the size of our budget, and what we're dealing with in budget situations, is beyond that reasonable amount for me, and the other thing is, either I'm assuming we delete the box or reword it. I'm in favor of just deleting it, and I'm assuming we're doing that.
Ms. Marati, then Ms. Burnett.
Through the chair, Ms. Dillard, did you mention something about federal regulations and the amount?
No, when I mentioned that, it has to do with the fact that there are quite a few purchases that are exempt from the formal bidding process by federal regulations.
Gotcha.
And that was the part that I checked on with legal to ensure that there wasn't any threshold there.
And there is no
There's
threshold,
not,
there's just exempt or not exempt?
correct.
Gotcha. Man, we just talked about how I trust administration with 100,000. And after all of that discussion, I still trust the administration with 100,000. I trust the administration with millions. But for our board accountability piece, I would like the board to review anything over 100,000. No less, but that's where I think I stand. So I don't support the change to 200,000 at this time. And like Mr. Doran said, we just changed a few things up to 100,000. It seems soon, but I can see in our future upping it later, just not yet.
Ms. Burnett?
So the way I'm reading this, it's only the things that we've already approved for you to spend the money on, which I understand would be it, because it says budget, which means so would anything that would be encompassed within that budget, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Can I provide a comment as well, President Hardy? Thank you. And you know, I can appreciate the comments from Mr. Dorn, Ms. Marati. The intent was, and Ms. Dillard referenced this, the intent is to line up numbers in 3300 with 3311. I would say 3311 is more important to us, going back to the capacity of our purchasing department, because it's in the arena of requirements to go through a formal RFP process, which is very time consuming on the department. So, you know, I can appreciate comments on 3,300 and you know, I think we can live with a $100,000 number. It's more important, 3,311, and just increasing the threshold of requirements for a formal RFP process. Important to emphasize, that does not mean that there's not due diligence being done. There's a competitive bid process, a couple different layers of competitive bidding processes that the department goes through. Just a formal RFP takes weeks for somebody to accomplish in that department. So I'll leave it at that.
Follow-up, Ms.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. Could you give an example of a bid, something that goes through the RFP process, something that you would put an informal or a formal bid on? Just so I understand.
An item or what?
Anything, just, yeah, like what would be something that we would put through a process to bid on?
Yeah, it's a monetary threshold. Once you surpass $10,000, there's a specific amount of rigor in the process. Once you go past $25,000, there's a little bit more. And then right now it's $100,000 requires that formal RFP. And so, you know, something that would cost $105,000 right now, that requires the entire RFP process. And so, you know, the wording in 3311 would increase that threshold to where it would still be a complete competitive bid process where scope is provided, specifics, details on what the district needs, specs on the product or service, but it's a whole nother level, the RFP, the full-blown RFP process that the department has to go through. So,
Ms. Marati?
I love this conversation. I appreciate Mr. DeGraw's understanding and empathy on our reasoning for the contracting at 100,000. The RFP does not process. It does not solidify the agreement or the contract. It just allows them to go through the process. And as someone that's going through an RFP right now, I can empathize and relate to that. So I am in support of increasing the RFP or the bid amount threshold to 200,000 because it does not bind the district to that amount or whatever the contract amount is. And again, I appreciate the understanding of keeping the contract piece of it to award to the 100,000. I just have one question before I end that statement. Are there any state or federal regulations, such as the CFR on the next page, that regulate bid, the amounts that bids need to be formalized in? Oh, sorry, jeez.
yeah, that's another item that we checked with legal on, and there are no federal or state local laws.
Okay, so you looked at that CFR and it's not in there. There's no threshold in there?
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
Great. Then, yeah, I support keeping the number 3,300 at the 100,000 threshold and increasing 3311, the bid part, to 200,000 for all the reasons I said.
Mr. Doran.
Since we're looking at both of them together, and I think that's appropriate, is I'd say 100,000 on both. I gave my reasons in terms of the expenditure, and similarly for the bids, but also for the added reason that if we're asking somebody to do an RFP, to give us a bid, we're asking them to do a lot of work. And they should know that it's going through. My concern is that they put the work in and then it comes to us and we say no. I've watched that with other entities in town. And again, 100,000 is a lot of money. And I think in terms of our community, it's a lot of money and their perception to it. There's a reasonable argument to say, well, in this day and age, 100,000 doesn't go very far. $100 doesn't go as far as it used to. But, you're approaching the 200,000, you're approaching the $250,000. And I think for, again, part of our fiduciary oversight in terms of transparency with our community, 100,000 is an appropriate threshold, in my opinion, in both areas, as well as in respect of those who are filling out a bid and going through that process. They put a lot of work into that, and I don't want them caught at the other end. And again, I just want to preface that this has nothing to do with whether or not I trust administration, whether or not the importance of listening to their feedback. But I do think that the 100,000 is the appropriate threshold under both. And that's, for me, that's consistency there.
So putting myself in the queue, question, my understanding is that with 3311, raising that threshold requires the purchasing department to not go through an RFP process for things that are under $200,000. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the intent on doing that is that an RFP process is time-consuming and takes up a lot of staff hours in order to complete that process. So by raising the threshold, we allow them to effectively purchase the things that they need without requiring formal RFP. And the point, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm still new to this board.
Oh, you're right on.
The reason for an RFP is so that we get the most competitive price possible, and that's the original intent of why it's that check.
That's correct. Yeah, so the higher dollar amount that you get on a good or a service, the higher oftentimes the complexity is. And so requiring that more robust process, dots every I, crosses every T, make sure there's good understanding on both sides, the district describing what it needs, and then vendors, understanding that and being able to give accurate prices more and more. So with inflation, and there's certain segments of our world that inflation is more dramatic. The construction industry, it's completely out of control. The district can't put one little kindergarten not even a whole playground. A single little portion of a playground has surpassed $100,000. I mean, it's crazy. It's making me rethink my career choice. And so it's a double-edged sword on the department. It's the number, because of inflation, the number of formal RFPs that are required is going up. And I forgot the other part of that. So, and just decreased staffing. So fewer human resources in the building, more frequency of RFPs required because of inflationary pressures. But yeah, you were describing it accurately, President Hardy.
Ms. Burnett.
Thank you for that, Mr. DeGraw. I'm in favor of this language.
Mr. Doran.
very much with those comments in mind, I think, yes, things are going higher, and that, to me, says we need to look at not raising it to 200,000, because there are things we cannot do. We, if we use the playground equipment thing, and I was absolutely amazed at a recent where PTA bought the playground equipment, and the cost of putting it in place was astronomical, and we've watched those building costs and other things go up. Everything's gone up some, but I think that's why it also is important for us to keep an eye on it, be that we may not be able to do it, and before going to the work of even putting it out there, that we should know and say, yeah, sorry, don't put staff through that because we can't afford it. And again, when we start moving to that $250,000 mark, we're really looking at commitments that are being made that are not, that the board doesn't have eyesight on. And so it might be that actually if they have eyesight on it, they can save staff time. So I still find it very concerning.
So another question then, to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. The money that would be used in these bids is money that's already been appropriated to that department from the board inside their current operating budget, so they would have already had that money?
Certainly, yeah, the money being spent would stay within the bounds of the budget that the board had approved. Absolutely.
Mr. Doran.
So follow-up question related to that. It's within, this is an item that's come under a grant, so it's within our budget. We anticipated that it might be, $100,000, and it's coming in at $190,000. There's we've already allowed the superintendent to transfer up to 100,000, but I'm looking at saying, well, if we had thought in the budget that was going to cost double, we might not have approved it. And there are enough projects that can come up and things that, yes, that'd be nice to have, but when we find out the actual price, it goes much less on the priority, further down on the priority list.
Mr. Burgess.
So I got to say, I'm pretty indecisive with this one. I hear very strong arguments from both sides. And I've been through the RFP process at my job many times. I'm sure it's a little bit different in environmental world than here, but it is time consuming and a pretty heavy burden, assuming there are similarities. And so I would be interested in exploring increasing this number for that reason. If we can, through our policies, make the work easier on our people and potentially more efficient, that's a good thing to do. I'm wondering if we should maybe split the difference here, do some compromise, since there seems to be opinions all around. But the other thing that I'd like to look into is what threshold our borough assembly uses, and maybe the city and North Pole as well, to see if we're within the same ballpark and being consistent there.
Just for context for the group, yeah, we'll look into that and I'll get numbers. I'm pretty sure the state is at $100,000. They're at $200,000 for construction-related items, And then AASB, I believe, is suggesting $150,000 threshold. And so just for context and numbers, speaking to splitting the difference or something of that nature, so.
Thank you.
But we can get information to the board on that,
Ms. Marati?
Through the chair to administration, would mimicking the state's delineation from 100,000 for non-construction and 200,000 for construction ease up, make it be a significant ease of burden?
I would say some, Ms. Marati. I would hope that we could maybe shoot for the AASB's suggestion of 150 and then 200 on the construction-related items. But, I just want to stress, to Mr. Doran's comments, just want to stress that in my area, every department is extremely scrupulous and pays huge attention to detail. Of all of them, the purchasing department it just has a amazing, unbelievable desire to be good stewards of our district's resources. And so I would not bring these suggestions to the board if I thought there was any way that they couldn't uphold the highest of high standards, even with these increased thresholds. So I just want that to be known. Appreciating Mr. Doran's comments.
Ms. Marati, then Mr. Doran.
I support, it's like a hybrid of Mr. DeGraw and Mr. Burgess's compromise of 150,000 for non-construction and 200,000 for construction. I'm doing construction with my personal house. I can't even imagine commercial construction prices right now. I don't want to even think about it. So I do see a need for that to be higher, and potentially 150,000 will, for non-construction, will taste better to those that want to keep it lower.
Mr. Doran, then Mr. Burgess.
Couple of questions. In terms of construction, and at 200,000 approaching $250,000, do we typically do that, or is that more the borough when it reaches that level?
I'm not 100% sure on that. I will find out.
Okay, because I do believe that's by the time we're out of maintenance, we're into. But there are times when we probably do have projects. But
yes. So as
I'll let you go ahead.
I'm answering on the fly, and I'm in the purchasing world all over, but I'm not a proclaimed expert in the purchasing arena. But as the wheels were spinning and as you continued to talk there, I do know that we do have projects, not often, but there are times when we do have construction projects that do surpass $100,000. And so I know there are times that we will do an RFP for construction-related projects. So, but I'll find out specifics.
If you could, thank you. Thank you. I'll leave the question there. Sure, and then come back to me.
Mr. Burgess?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to support the earlier suggestion from Mr. DeGraw that we go with 150 and 200 for construction. That's how I feel at the moment. But with, as we get more information as requested, that could change.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, so two related questions. Am I correct that this somewhat parallels the 440s of our current?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, I wanted to make sure. And a process question, when these do come to us as a board, we will see, as has been our practice, what our current policy is and what the proposal is. So we are very clear on what we have and the public is clear on what we're changing.
I don't believe that's the way that we had intended to bring it to the board. I mean, given that we're going to bring entire chapters to the board, that could be pretty cumbersome in terms of bringing all of our current policy alongside of it. Our current policy will certainly be still live online, so if there's anybody interested in cross-referencing, they could do that. But it would be a pretty big task to bring both current policy, what we're suggesting, and then potentially some kind of hybrid, because, you know, this is the work that the board is doing right now, is to try to determine whether or not they're bringing, you know, you're bringing our policy currently into these policies or creating some kind of hybrid of sorts. And so it wasn't our intention to bring, you know, the old policy alongside of it, given that extra work involved in that.
Ms. Dillard?
Sorry, when I answered your question, I was thinking in how the language is in this policy and the bids policy aligns with our policy and practice in purchasing and contracting. But when you look at the whole chapter, Chapter 4 and Chapter 7, it does not align with AASB. It's what we address it does not perfectly fit into an AASB policy aligned policy to policy. So it would be very difficult to show the changes from one policy to the next from policy to policy.
Okay. Follow up, but I am correct that this particular 3311 would most closely align with the 440 section of our current policies. I want to make sure.
Yes, that is correct.
But we find it very difficult to be able to say what we're replacing. And okay, and I guess my only concern with that is that so it behooves us to make sure that it behooves me, I'll speak for myself, lay out both policies where they do. It's basically a realignment, so we know what we've changed, and so we understand what those implications are. Okay.
Ms. Dillard?
Yes, I have cross-referenced every policy.
Good.
Mr. Doran?
So you've cross-referenced every policy with our current policy, and those are, but not in the references that are listed in the rewrites. They're not listed there. I mean, you've made notations, just so I understand what I'm looking for.
It's been a process of, you know, we might have 10 policies that are one sentence or two sentences, and the content of those policies are in one or two ASB policies. So I've gone through to say, yes, this has been captured by this policy, or no, this has not, and then it's been a discussion, well, where do we need to capture this? But in that way, I've cross-referenced in, you know, like a spreadsheet.
Okay, and maybe that would be helpful at that time to get that spreadsheet or something, so it's easy for us to cross-check.
Yep. And I've seen the spreadsheet. She has it up there, and I definitely would be in support of Ms. Dillard and Mr. Doran maybe having a conversation and looking through the spreadsheet and showing all of that, maybe in another time. I will just put myself on the record of saying I'm in support of what Mr. Burgess also said, the hybrid of 3,300 staying where it is, and then doing 150 and 200,000. I think that's where the board has sort of landed on that.
So last one in Article 3. This is policy 3470, and so we brought this just forward for information. It's quite, there's a lot of additions to the language and explanation of what goes under fund balance. We have a 2-paragraph policy on fund balance, and so we just brought this forward for information, and if you have any questions about it.
Yeah, just in addition to that, administration would be in favor of keeping our fund balance policy relatively as is. Maybe just, it's a little bit cumbersome in that it states a percentage less than what the state allows, and it might just be cleaner just to state it's equivalent to 6 to 8%. the current policy and just maybe more simply state 6 to 8%, 6 to 8% of current year general fund expenditures, which is what it is. So we might just bring forth streamlined language that has the same exact intent and definition as the current policy.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, so let me come back because it may have changed my comments or questions on this. So this writing is not what the administration is recommending.
No, again, just informational purposes. I would state this language. My personal position is the extent of this language does not belong in board policy, as it would confuse the layperson. This is certainly all information that applies to a fund balance and how a district manages and sets its fund balance and determines it, but would not necessarily belong in board policy, in my opinion.
Okay, so
Mr. Doran, follow up.
follow up with that, then I guess, yes, it did cause some confusion for me. So I would agree that, that I'm wondering in terms of what information we're to do, and there are some fund balances that's titles that we typically don't reference, I'm thinking. And my other, another observation was in the spending prioritization, what it says is you used your restricted and before it would seem you would use your unrestricted or, that for me was very confusing and in reverse order. And then my one other comment with it was in terms of the 60% reference in the minimum unrestricted fund and the in terms of maximum, it talks about state, but there's also we have a barrel factor, and as far as I'm concerned, the state rules on that one. But I had questions, so as you're taking it back informationally, I'll just give you those questions to factor in and see what you bring towards or not.
Yes, and I concur with your statements, Mr. Doran, and yes, I would agree. We would tailor the language around the state calculation.
Ms. Marati?
My computer crashed. If you could come back to me later.
And up on the screen is our current board policy. Diana wanted to bring 3470 to the board because that is what's in AASB's model policy, and Anchorage and some other school districts have it closely aligned to AASB, and so wanted the board to take a look at that and have a discussion. But it sounds like Mr. DeGraw is recommending that we go forward with our current policy and with some recommended changes. So.
Ms. Burnett?
Thank you. I like our policy a lot, and I I agree. I think that we should keep what we have. Though I would be in favor of the definitions being put into our policy or as a reference point of something, just because I think it's really good informationally. I didn't know what each fund meant, and so, I mean, that's good information to have in there. So I would be in favor of our policy with the definitions of each fund balance.
So, question, at one point, I thought we discussed maybe making a definitions chapter, or I know it was like, I think we're up at the dais discussing it. Did that ever, I don't totally remember where it landed. So was that something that was done, or?
No,
Okay.
that was not something that I picked up and ran with, no.
Ms. Marati?
In reading if we're going to keep the current policy, in reading it, it talks about our CFO, which we don't have anymore. And every other policy in this chapter and kind of in our bylaws, operations areas, it states the superintendent. And I know the superintendent is not our financial guru, but I wonder if that needs to just say our superintendent or delegate, and knowing that you would delegate that to whomever fills the CFO or COO position. It's the last sentence in the second paragraph. And I would love administration's opinion. I won't die on this hill. It's just something that I noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I believe some upcoming policies we have switched to being departmental specific to call out, individual roles. But in this realm, I mean, given that we have a chief operations officer, maybe it should just say the chief operations officer will review updates. Or we could, either way, I think it's fine, or the superintendent and designee. But I do know upcoming policy that we'll bring in front of the board will be somewhat departmental specific to call out specific roles within the department or within the district.
Ms. Marati.
Follow up, thank you. I appreciate that, but I wonder if, like, at some point in time, we're going to go back to CFO versus COO. So calling out that specific position might require the board to go back and change it, and just putting it under something more vague, but still requiring it might prevent that from needing to happen. But yeah.
Mr. Doran.
And a question, but since it's not recommended, it's, but that comes to me is, we have 4 fund balances that you can't spend. They all say the same thing. Are they separate under GASP or the government accounting practices? Do they make those distinctions of 4 things you can't spend?
Yes, Mr. Doran, they do. Yeah, so our annual audit breaks out it lays out a total fund balance, and then it segregates them into the separate areas, non-spendable, restricted, assigned, et cetera, and then it also identifies the unrestricted available. That's typically what's available to the school district, so yes, it does.
Thank you.
Ms. Dillard.
Okay. I think that completes what we were going to discuss for Article 3. So we're going to jump over to a policy in Article 9, and I apologize, this was on the agenda for the work session last week, which we did not get to, and I did not add it to the agenda tonight. And so this is, you can see it on the board, it is Article 9311, and it's in regards to school board policies. And this is a policy we actually did discuss a couple of work sessions ago, and we changed some language to align with practice when it comes to policy implementation with the board. And so we added this number 1, which says report to the board. Their proposal shall be made in a report to the board. Again, that's not in our current policy, but it is has been a current practice, so we added that language. But after further discussion, we would like to suggest that we do not add that as a separate policy language and as a practice, and to stay with moving policies formally through the board in 2 meetings, so that the first one would be a report to the board in first reading, and then the second reading would be after that. So with the goal of being able to move policies through the board through 2 meetings instead of 3.
And I can speak, this was brought up to me in one of my discussions with administration and Ms. Dillard, and that it gives us flexibility. It doesn't prohibit us from taking 3 meetings to pass something that might need more consideration, but it gives us the flexibility for things that are ready to go to report and first reading in the same meeting, because otherwise this could take a very long time. So it was the past practice of the board. This is what our current policy reads. We would be changing it to having it be report, first reading, second reading. That's kind of been what's happening, but it hasn't been what was written in policy. Ms. Burnett, then Mr. Dorrant.
So we have been doing it the long way, so this will, so how does that work if we're able to do a report and a first reading? Because that means we would have to have discussion, right? Doesn't one fall under informational and one fall under action? So how would that work in the agenda?
It would be a action item. So, and then obviously in that first reading, the board can take action whether or not it proceeds to second reading or kicking it back for, you know, either the policy committee to look at or reworking language. So it would be an action item on the agenda.
Follow up?
Yeah, follow up. So it would look something like board policy 9311 report in first reading is what it would look like under the action item?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Doran?
Okay. As I mentioned last time, I definitely favor the report first, and I'll address that. But first, to address report and first reading is, in a sense, redundant. It's a first reading. And if we're going to skip a report, then we should skip the report. It's first reading. You're taking action. You can send it back, or, I mean, whatever action you have, you can say yes, no, send it back. The advantage that I have found really for the report, first and second reading, is that there have been often enough times when there have been some real questions about the policy, and to have that sent back and those answered prior to come to first reading has been productive in my experience over the years. It is a little longer. I'm cognizant that we're doing something quite significant right now, but in terms of policy and practice, doing a report and then having first reading. In terms of what we're doing now, I think there are so many changes that the public should also be aware. Most of them, they range in significance, let me say. But I have watched the boards over the years as a watcher and also as a participant, where it has gone back, good questions, clarifications to the administration. They've been able to address those, and then when it comes to first reading, then we're really it's a less significant changing conversation. And one time that I particularly remember, and it's not the only time that it's happened, but one time when we had the report, the board gave significant suggestions and comments during the report part, but then when it came to first reading, those had not been addressed, and we wound up asking the same questions. And so we, that should have been addressed, and I think that's why the opportunity during that report time is really good to get those addressed before we come back, and then you wind up in first reading trying to, make amendments that could have been answered and should have been answered before. So I think in terms of the long term, that report time is most critical, and then when it comes to first reading, there's limited need for an amendment, limited, we can express whether we agree or disagree with certain parts of it, but you're limiting that time, and in the long time, first and second reading go faster. So I would advocate keeping the report to the board as the initial step, and then first and second reading, and then noted redundancy in terms of the way it's suggested tonight.
Ms. Burnett?
So I'm actually going to respectfully disagree. When an item hits our agenda and we get our agenda on Thursday evening, Friday morning, we have a whole weekend to read it, digest it, get our questions formulated, whether we send them in or whether we wait till our board meeting to ask them. I'm just gonna be honest, and I can't tell you how many times I've been driven crazy because we get something before us and we can't act on it. We can't really do much work on it. We get the report, we kind of all stare at each other like, okay, and then we move on to the next item. And that's just real. I go back and I'm a board nerd and I rewatch our board meetings like crazy. And I can't tell you how many times we kind of all just sit there and stare at each other like, what's next? So in my opinion, this will avoid that what's next option and lets us get to work on it. And I don't know, maybe it was Dr. Minor that said it, or maybe it was you, Ms. Hardy, but we can kick this back. This doesn't have to stay. We can decide that, okay, we're gonna send this back again for another first reading. Just because it's a first reading doesn't mean we can't have a second first reading or a third. That's how these processes work. I would really appreciate doing the work and not just having a report in front of us. I would actually like to work on it and act on it. So I would be in favor of this turning to a first reading.
Ms. Marati?
Thanks. I realize how much work this board has to do when it comes to policies over the next year. And I'm usually not in favor of making changes for short-term things like a year, but there's so many things and policies that we are not agreeing on or getting consensus on that we're going to have to bring to the board, that by eliminating the report section and keeping the first reading and second reading and more if needed, I suppose, like Ms. Burnett was saying, I feel like we can be a more efficient board while still maintaining stakeholder involvement and testimony and hearing our community. We're staring at you.
We're all staring at Bobby. Does Bobby do the same?
Mr. Burgess?
I'm in favor of improving efficiency.
I am also in favor of proceeding with first and second reading, knowing that we can always create another reading when needed.
With that, we are going to move to the last policy, and this was in your agenda packet tonight. This is in Article 9 work session packet, and it's going to be policy 9130.1, and it's on page 8. It's on page 8. It is the ad hoc one. I guess that's helpful too. Yeah. So you want to go back and finish, okay, so we'll finish the other administrative regulation after this one. So ad hoc advisory committees, this was a policy that was created and drafted with the board back in the January 2-day retreat. And then after taking some of that feedback, President Hardy and I did work on some of the language to clarify what an ad hoc advisory committee was. And so this last paragraph was added to this policy. However, based on the conversation at last Monday's work session, I did add board member work groups as a title because we talked about differentiating what would be an ad hoc committee or not. And then Dr. Minor does have legal feedback on this position too.
Yeah, so and I just got this feedback today, and so it's not reflective of what's on here, but Mr. Sedor's recommendation is to delete that last chapter. He thinks it may cause some confusion. He did want the board to be aware that Open Meetings Act, or OMA, does apply to ad hoc advisory committees. And so anytime three members, even 3 members or less, if the president's given that charge of establishing an ad hoc advisory committee, that OMA does apply to it in terms of the notification process and then it being available for the community to sit in. And I know we discussed this a little bit last time or a couple times ago. Mr. Doran, you said, well, thinking about the ad hoc committee that worked on the superintendent contract, because, you know, more sensitive types of things. And Mr. Sedor said at that point in time, then the ad hoc committee would go into executive session under the same ground rules that a board would. And in that instance, I think it's C2, but that ad hoc committees, if they were working on sensitive things, could go into executive session if it met the ground rules for executive session of the entire board.
So, question,
So many questions.
because part of this came out of a discussion this year in which the board did not officially create an ad hoc for working on a joint resolution. It was never officially created. And since it was 3 or less members of both boards, it was what we were calling, and I've received legal input from Ms. Dolan, that does not fall under OMA because it was not created through official board appointment, and that's where it was clarified that we've been using the word ad hoc incorrectly, because ad hoc implies that it is officially created charged by the president, created through an act or a board. So an example that we need to get on, and Mr. Burgess is on this one, and so is Ms. Maple and Ms. Richardson, is our onboarding ad hoc that we created in a work group. And that was, we all discussed this was something we would, and we went through a formal process of saying who would be on that. And so we keep meaning to schedule an official time that we publicly notice that we're going to work on onboarding. So we've maybe created extra work for ourselves in doing that because now we have to follow OMA. So the reason that extra piece was written there was to make it clear that there is a difference if 3 board members choose to work on something, that is not an ad hoc. That's 3 board members choosing to work together versus official board action creating something that definitely falls under OMA. I don't know if that made it clearer, but Ms. Burnett.
So I'm just thinking about like things that we probably have done wrong. And I get that doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but we're hashing this out now, so we're learning. So Sedor wants to delete this whole thing, right? Or just that bottom portion?
Just the bottom portion would be his recommendation, because he's, even with the 3 or less making the decision themselves, he thinks that they're still conducting board business, and so that it should be publicly noticed.
I don't disagree.
Ms. Marati.
So just to clarify, at any time, if any board members meet, no matter the number, so it could be 2, OMA is created and notice is required. Like, I can't go have lunch with Ms. Burnett.
I think,
That's completely different than the thing that we attended with Mr. Sedor and talking about all of us being superheroes and how a serial meeting is created as soon as 4 people come together, not 3. I mean, it was a very vivid PowerPoint.
It was.
That was, look, and then we went through question and answer. I don't know if it was the new onboarding. It's when he onboarded new members. And he would say, 2 people are talking. It was in front of a Capitol building that are both board members. I mean, I very vividly remember it. And then a 3rd person comes up. Have you broken OMA? No, you have not. But then one of those members called in another friend, and now there's 4 of you. Had you broken OMA? Yes. This is now our serial meeting. And so this is confusing. If it,
Can I
yeah.
finish?
Sure.
So so that being said, and obvious confusion, I mean, I've done this for 5.5 years, and now I'm still confused on this because it always changes, right? Could we, I have a question. Who in our bylaws is, or agreement with Jill Dolan and Mr. Sedor, who is our OMA go-to?
I would need to double check because I don't
Okay.
have that memorized, but I
So-
believe it would be,
That is, oh, go ahead.
I believe it would be Mr. Sedor, but
Okay.
I will double check
So,
that.
so that is ask number one. Then number two, could we go back to that person, only that person, because this is where two attorneys get so confusing. So only go back to that person and ask again. And I know that seems redundant, but this is so backwards from what we've all been taught for years. And so I just want one more check, like, are you sure? And then if it's still true, could he come explain that to us?
Yes, and
And
it was
it's
certainly.
his fault because he's the one that taught us all otherwise.
So certainly new information for me as well, and I specifically said the words, "Oh, you learn something new every day," and I said that today. But I do think there's a difference between the intentionality of three members getting together and then this verbiage, say, collaborate and work on something versus, 3 or 4 members showing up at something and it being an
different.
event. And so I can certainly take this back to Mr. Sedor and have him write out, something more if we feel like we need a descriptor or, I guess, something different on this last paragraph, or, I guess my suggestion to the board would be to delete it because the rest of the ad hoc portion is above that line.
Follow up, then Ms. Burnett, then Mr. Doran.
Even if it's board business, I have been taught that 2 board members can talk about board business, 3 board members, as long as it doesn't turn into a serial meeting, and because we can't vote on anything. And so even if it's about board or school or whatever, if we could ask him again, does that require notice and cause an OMA situation? And I said him, but I really want to know who our OMA guru is. Oh, you got it?
This is the memo that we added as an administrative regular and as an exhibit for the attorney use, but I'm not sure where it falls under here or if it does.
Meeting notices, timelines, and procedures. I think it would be then district council, which is Mr. Sedor. Okay, so that one's done. Thank you. So if we could just ask him again.
Ms. Burnett.
So I kind of just want to go back to what Ms. Hardy was saying. During AASB, our very first board sessions with Mr. Sedor, we went exactly through that, and I specifically remember that because Brandy and I got named with our rock song names in that conversation, and it was very memorable. So it stood out to me, that conversation as well, and so I would also be in favor of even being like, hey, Mr. Sedor.
Yeah.
I remember when you were all, Brandy, you're a fine girl, and sweet Melissa.
And so, again, I'm coming back to, I think that is okay, but us naming this other name of trying to say it's a work group is problematic. And I think that's where the issue comes in, is like, it feels like you're trying to circumvent the rule of an ad hoc committee. And that's what this policy is talking about, is ad hoc committees. We're not talking about any other issues of board members getting together and breaking OMA in those instances.
Mr. Doran, then Mr. Burgess, then Ms. Burnett. It looked like maybe hands.
Maybe.
So I agree the last paragraph doesn't belong here, but I'm glad we're having the conversation as we started the last time. We have used ad hoc rather loosely and broadly. I shouldn't say loosely, broadly. Thinking of an ad hoc committee that, it's not one of our standing committees, it's a committee that, or task group, kind of went around. I remember it followed the failure of a bond issue for Denali and Nordell, and the board and administration pulled together an ad hoc committee from both schools to work on and explore whether one of them should close and where to go forward and some different issues. It was temporary in nature, and it was not meant to continue on, and that fell very much within an ad hoc committee piece. And again, there were advisory. And I contrast that with, for instance, the working group, but I think we've referred to it as ad hoc on 3 board members to bring forth some recommendations on committees. It was said publicly, those 3 were going to bring back that information. That's it. We've done it with others. There's a working group on onboarding. At various times, different boards, and I'm going back with some perspective, have done that. 2 or 3 members work on this, bring it back. It's public that that topic is being done. Those members were assigned to that to do it, and they brought it back in very public discussion. To my knowledge, we have never run into a problem with that. Called on the training that has been consistent is 3 or less can operate. Yes, I really want to know what's the court case that has changed it. Yeah. But I do think that eliminating, for the purpose of this policy, eliminating that last paragraph and then addressing it perhaps as a 9130.2 or such working group that clarifies that we can indeed appoint a working group or whatever title we give it, as long as it's not ad hoc, and then going forward we make sure we use the right terminology.
Mr. Burgess, maybe Ms. Burnett, and then Ms. Marati.
I just want to say that I agree that this seems like unnecessary and potentially confusing. I don't think we need to restate what OMA allows or doesn't allow in our policy. And I expect that when we get clarification from CDOR, it will be, as Dr. Meinert described, that the difference is that we are creating a group as a board action, and then that group, and I don't know that it matters if we call it ad hoc or work group or what we title it. I think that the creation of a special group is probably what makes the difference. If we're not officially working in that capacity, I expect that it's okay for us to get together in smaller groups. But that's, again, we'll wait for that clarification, but I'm supportive of removing the paragraph.
I just want to state that OMA, the actual law, references the term ad hoc. So that is the reason why it is very important that we stop using that word if we don't mean it. Ms. Burnett.
Mr. Burgess kind of hit the nail on the head there. And let's just stop using ad hoc unless we mean it.
Ms. Marati.
I agree with Mr. Burgess, and I have a question before I cross this off my draft. When would we use a work group versus an ad hoc if we now understand the definition of an ad hoc? Is it even needed?
So ad hoc brings with it needing to publicly notice the meeting and follow all of OMA. So if 2 board members or 3 board members wanted to work on a resolution, that would mean then it requires Ms. Richardson to notice and hold the meeting in a place available to the public and go through all of that. Where I could see there being times when board members want to work on something and bring it to the board, that wouldn't require all of that. The whole board doesn't even know that it's going on. They're considering and doing their own things. So that's their working group bringing something to us.
But it's not a fit, sorry, may I follow up?
Yes.
But so in that scenario, it's not something that the board has officially requested. It's just board members choosing to get together to work on board business.
Yeah. So I'm with you. My one question back to that is, if I want to do something, or the board president, if it were not me, and wanted to work with two other people, how do we make sure that that's also a possibility? But I think it's the president retains all the rights to act as a regular board member. Because this, an ad hoc is created by the president through board action. So that's my one, like the joint resolution, that was my idea. And I didn't get collective, I was like, and then saying, would other people like to do this? And I kind of said, hey, would you join? Before we, yeah.
To follow up, though, that was in the past, before we had a better understanding of ad hoc. Now that we have an understanding of ad hoc, should the board or board members want to work on something official, then wouldn't it just be an ad hoc committee?
Mr. Doran.
I think in terms of this policy, the definition of ad hoc, or the description, is very specific.
Yeah.
It's members will be broadly representative of the community, so it's beyond the board. And so that's an ad hoc committee. It's not as opposed to a standing committee. This is formed for a purpose, and it's broadly representative. I think, and so the last paragraph does not relate to what our description of an ad hoc is. In terms of maybe the question going forward is, do we have to specify that, if 2 or 3 members are asked by the board, would you look at something and then bring back what you find? That is not an ad hoc. So as everyone has said, or most people at least have said, we have to stop using ad hoc to refer to that. What we call, do we need to actually have it in policy, as long as we are not in violation of OMA?
I don't think we need to have it in policy. I'm fine with scrapping that paragraph. I would say that we all need to be really careful and remind our other board members that it isn't the board appointing. It's a board member saying, I'm going to work on this. Bobby, would you like to join me? So that we don't unintentionally create an ad hoc of the board. It is a member saying, I'm planning to do this, and if you want to, you can talk to me later and we'll talk about it. But like the ad hoc committee on onboarding, it does involve a non-board member. We discussed it at a thing. It is an ad hoc at this point. Like, it's an officially created thing, and we need to follow all of OMA when we do it. Mr. Doran.
Okay. I guess I would like clarification, because that is not our definition of an ad hoc. And I think that we need to look and see, can we do things like when the committee group, 3 board members were asked to look at committees and bring back a recommendation for the full board. You've asked 2 committee members to, work on the 2 board members to work on the onboarding. I think we still need to explore that avenue for us, and I think it's good that as a public piece we can say, go ahead and 2 or 3 people work on this and then bring it back. That, I think that helps our public. So.
Ms. Marati.
Okay, so through the chair, Mr. Doran, are you saying you want the ability to have board member work groups?
Yes, and I think it's important for our working operation and smoothness. And I think that can be, should be public. There are times when those are public. and really should be public. This is something we're grappling with. We want to get that information, whether it is something to say,
I get it.
okay, yeah, anyway, yes.
If legal.
That it's, right. And I really want to find out how we can do it. It stays within legality.
So, Dr. Minor, could we add that to?
Absolutely. So I'll seek legal guidance and bring that back, and I'm sure he'd be available for a work session as well, because it does seem like there'd be a lot of questions around it. So.
And just for clarity, it is not for an ad hoc. It's for this other.
Thank you. The very last page is going to be page number 7. We're still in Article 9, so we are completing the conversation around the administrative regulation to 9130. 9130. So page 7, I did add, I'll just summarize it real quick and then get feedback. For meetings, I did just add the language about committee meetings schedules will be determined by the committee chair at the beginning of the term. Meeting frequency will depend on the charge of the committee. And so that was in response to some of the conversation that I heard last Monday. And then the attendance threshold of 3 missed meetings I added. And then board's committee standards we are not going to discuss because we have discussed this and we know that we are going to be getting language from CDOR on what can go here.
I know Ms. Marati had a pre-existing one, and then Mr. Burgess.
I have a clarification needed for committee meeting schedules. Does the word schedules mean the day of the month?
Well, I believe the conversation at the time was our current policy speaks to, so it says are encouraged to schedule quarterly meetings and how that is not always needed and or practice.
In that case, then the first and second sentences may be redundant because then it talks about the frequency of them, right? If schedules doesn't mean day of the month, it means how often they meet, and then the meeting frequency depends on the charge of the committee. I guess it's no. Now that I apologize. Now that I reread it, one has to do with the charge, one has to do with who makes the decision. Okay, then that takes me back to, so right now, the diversity committee is looking at our workload for the rest of the year. We're taking the summer off per policy, and we will be determining at our next diversity committee meeting how often, so the frequency we're going to meet, and what days, so the schedule. And it's at the end of this term. I suppose, I guess whenever the terms, what does the term for the committee mean? Is that, so if it's November through October, then we're at the middle of the term. But we really need to make that decision now. So all of that being said, I would ask that the term time, the beginning of the term, be removed. It's up to the committee. I know the budget committee has an interesting schedule. Curriculum committee might have, higher needs in one time than the other. And so requiring that the whole term is determined at the beginning of the term can make it difficult for work to get done. And then my other question, if it's okay, is under attendance. Can we, I thought, and maybe I was wrong, thought we talked about it being 3 meetings in a row. So 6, I don't know, was that subsequently? Consecutively, thank you. If we could add that, that would help with when we have to make that decision. Because 3 meetings could be anywhere.
Mr. Burgess, then Mr. Doran.
I want to support Ms. Marati's comments. And just to add on at the very beginning, when we say that the schedule will be determined by the committee chair, I'm not sure that that's in keeping with practice because I honestly let Shane just schedule everything for us. So, I think maybe saying that be determined by the committee chair and administration or administrative representative on the committee. or in consultation with, yeah, like, yeah.
Mr. Doran.
Several things. I like that in consultation because if they need material available and stuff like this and staffing there. I also like striking at the beginning of the term because I think reality is, as you go through, you see what you need. I just wanted to say, and I agree with, I'm okay with the encouraging quarterly meetings. I believe when that was put in, it was because there was a question of meeting so often that, you know, you were overusing people, in a sense. And I think that, so I'm okay with, because striking that, because yes, some are front-loaded, some are, you know, curriculum usually gets more busy in the spring, budget is more busy in the fall, early winter. You know, the other committees might actually be good. You know, I'm thinking family engagement might, you know, a quarterly meeting in terms of what their needs are. So I'm just supportive of those types of things there, so. And do we want to address attendance?
I did.
Okay. So if I might, I like the 50%. I am very concerned with 3 because if it is a committee that only meets 4 times a year, now they've missed half of them. If it's 3 in a row, well, I only have to show up once, maybe a year, or twice during the whole year, and I'm missing out on all the other things. I think the 50% is, and then it's applicable to all committees, whatever, you know, if you miss 3, that's a chunk of time to be considered. And it does say you may, and I think the may is important, rather than you will be. You know, again, there are circumstances that come up and we can flex that. But I am concerned about 3 applicable to every committee and certainly not consecutive, because that's easy enough to say, oh, well, I'm here today, but I'll see you in another month, 2 months, 3 months. I like the 50%.
Mr. Burgess.
Appreciate those comments, and yeah, for committees that meet infrequently, it may be sort of yeah, it might be that a member missing 3 meetings misses more work than in some other committees. So I understand the concern there. My concern with using 50% over a school year is that you don't know how many they missed until the school year's over and the work is over. And for some of our committees that do meet frequently, we want everybody there as much as possible, and that's got to be, they have to understand that they can be removed for missing meetings. If we're going to wait until the end of the school year to tally if it's 50% or more, you know, some terms are already up. So, you know, maybe there might be a way to split the difference here. We could do an or, you know, 50%, either 50% of the meetings or 3 consecutive meetings. I don't know if that would help alleviate concerns, but that's one idea. And then the other thing that we could do is, you know, say 50% of meetings within a given time frame, rather than over, you know, a shorter time frame, rather than over an entire term, at which point it essentially becomes meaningless for certain members who have one, you know, who have 1-term limits.
Ms. Burnett.
1-year limits.
I don't think we need to overcomplicate this, and we seem to overcomplicate a lot of things. I do appreciate Mr. Burgess's comments, though, with the or. 50% or 3, whichever is less, or more, whatever language, verbiage the board wants to settle on there, but it's easy, it doesn't complicate it, it's 50% or 3.
Mr. Burgess.
I did also want to clarify that it's 3 consecutive meetings.
Yeah.
So 3 meetings in a row was the intent, and Ms. Marati mentioned that earlier as well. So, so it's not a total of 3, because there's reasons that people might need to be excused periodically, but 3 in a row, and then it's still a may, so if like that person had an emergency or a vacation or whatever, the chair has the discretion to say, no, it was okay.
Mr. Doran.
Okay. I appreciate the comments, and it's got me thinking, I'm okay with 3 without consecutive. And the reason is because whether in consecutive or not, if you miss 2, then you come for 1, or you miss 1, then you came for 1, and then you miss 2, it's 3 meetings. And given our numbers, and again, it's May, but if you only come to 1 meeting, then that's, so I think it gets us to the same place. I understand in terms of the 50%, it could be more problematic, and it is, and I was really persuaded by your comment about if you really don't know what 50% is, because you don't necessarily have, we don't have an exact number of meetings. It can vary, so I'm comfortable with 3 straight meetings.
Mr. Burgess.
I'm not gonna hold on to the word consecutive too strongly here. I'm okay with that change.
I think we're landing on 3. Does not need to be consecutive. And it is now 8:20. I would suggest that we wrap it up for the night, unless not seeing any objections. We are adjourned.